Next testifier.
My name is Randall Roth. I'm in opposition to Bill 33. Whether we're talking about a capital budget, we're talking about an operating budget, we're talking about authorization to issue general obligation bonds, we're talking about spending billions and billions and billions of additional money that sooner or later is going to be paid by the taxpayers of this county. The taxes are going to have to be paid, and it's the same dollar amount whether we're talking about the GET tax, property tax, TAT, whatever that tax. Those people who understand how these taxes are structured recognize that the difference, the major difference between the GET, which is currently used, and the property tax, which council members are saying they can't imagine using, is simply that the GET hides the true cost of this. Most of the GET tax that gets paid by businesses, it's a business tax, most of that gets baked into the cost of goods and services in Hawaii. People don't realize how much they're incurring in general excise taxes because it doesn't show up as general excise taxes. The 4.71% that is passed on to them at the cash register is the small portion of those taxes. And the GET tax is notoriously regressive. And that may just sound like a word to people who don't understand. It is disproportionately burdensome on low and middle income people. The property tax is either marginally regressive or a little bit progressive. So as a mechanism, it is far more fair to use property taxes. The only reason you talk about never using the property tax is because people see how much those taxes are. They understand what the burden would be. At a minimum, let's be honest with the people about who's going to bear the burden. And to say tourists pay a certain percentage of the GET, the Tax Review Commission of Hawaii has experts study this every 5 years, and without exception, they've said the export rate, that is the ability to get taxes paid by non-residents, is roughly the same with the property tax as with the general excise tax. That if there's a difference, the export rate is higher with property taxes than general excise tax. So to sit here and to pretend that it's anathema to raise property taxes, but you'll raise the general excise tax, is simply dishonest. At a minimum, be honest with the public in terms of what the burden in the future is going to be, paying for these bonds, paying these various expenses, and then if the public wants to support that, terrific. But I don't think you've been honest yet, and I don't think the public would support you if you were honest with the public. Thank you very much.
Okay, questions? Yeah, Vice Chair. Mr. Roth, we have a question for you.
Yes.
Mr. Roth, thanks for your analysis. Appreciate it. Can you tell us roughly how many real property taxpayers there are in the city?
I can't give you a number.
Okay. It's in the neighborhood of 260,000. We've had near record visitor arrivals, roughly 9 million. We have roughly 1 million citizens on this island. Why is it fairer to have roughly 260,000 folks shoulder this burden than to spread that burden around to north of 1 million people?
What you evidently don't understand is there's a difference between bearing the burden of a tax and directly paying that tax. And from a policy standpoint, policymakers like yourselves, the important piece of information is who bears the burden. So for example, when most of the general excise tax gets hidden, baked into the cost of goods and services that everybody pay here in Hawaii, that is a tax. They're bearing the burden of that tax even though it simply shows up in the form of the higher cost of goods and services. Property taxes, if you're just looking at who writes the check, of course, that's paid by the property owners. But when you study who bears the burden of that property tax, what you find is that what experts call the export rate is at least as high with the property tax as it is with the general excise tax. I am not suggesting that you raise property taxes. What I'm suggesting is that you be honest, finally be honest with the public about how much taxes are going to have to be paid and how much of that will be borne by the residents of this county or their kids or their grandkids. And until you've been honest about that, I really don't think it's fair for you to sit here and talk about, we won't raise property taxes, but we'll do these other things that you're implying aren't burdensome when they clearly are.
What this council seems to be wrestling with is the most equitable way to pay for this system.
Well, experts have studied that time after time after time. The reports of the tax review commissions are readily available. And without exception, they have concluded that the general excise tax is not by a little bit, but by far the most regressive mechanism for raising taxes in Hawaii. By far. It is clearly disproportionate, burdensome on low and middle income people. And so as a mechanism, it's not just not the best, it's the worst for funding rail. And you look at the other possible sources, and as a mechanism that'd be better, but you can't hide it, the burden, the way you're hiding the burden with the general excise tax. And that's why I'm focusing on finally being honest with the public rather than the specific decision that you have to make in front of you right now.
So would you argue then that, is your argument then that most property taxpayers can afford to pay versus most general excise tax surcharge?
No, I
payers
think if you
cannot?
were honest with the public as to what they would pay in property taxes in order to complete rail as it's currently planned, I think overwhelmingly they would say, no way, overwhelmingly. By my calculation, the amount of the excise tax surcharge, the 0.5%, that has been paid in and spent on rail for an average family of 4 works out to $5,880. Okay, that's already been incurred, the burden, it's been spent, it's gone. When you do the math based upon the city's numbers, which I think are grossly below what the cost would ultimately be, based on the city's current numbers, the amount yet that the average family of 4 would pay, again, most of it indirectly in terms of just higher rent and higher groceries and higher everything, goods and services in Hawaii, the average family of 4 has not yet paid, but would, if you keep going in the direction that you're going right now, would pay another $20,020 for every average family of 4. And
Over
when you
how
say,
much?
well, that's,
Over how much time?
when you're saying that's over the period of time that you're talking about finally paying for rail, that is borrowing this money and having a lot of it paid back long after the rail was finished. And the thing is, you say you're not willing to accept not having a rail or something to show for the billions that have been spent thus far. Rail is a classic white elephant that's going to cost so much to operate and to maintain, especially if you take into account what we know will be regular, huge needs to keep the rail renovated, to keep it safe, to keep it efficient, to keep it, clean, to all of the rail systems elsewhere that found the money to build it, but then are having a dickens of a time finding the money to keep it at the current level of service that it earlier was at. To my knowledge, you've not yet said to the public where that $100+ million a year just to keep it running, where it's going to come from. That's over and above what you can anticipate in the way of fair income. Where's that going to come from? And the FTA, just in the last few years, because of problems in other cities that have rail, have said, don't do this unless you're setting up a sinking fund. You're putting money in each year, so it'll be there when we know you're going to have to renovate the entire system. That would be another $100 million per year just to keep the sinking fund at the level being recommended, strongly recommended is their language, by the FTA. $200 million a year, where is that going to come from over and above any fair income that you might have? And in the meantime, you've got people like Councilman Martin's district where things that cost tiny, we've been rounding off to the nearest $1 billion. The mayor at 9.5 said, well, let's just call it 10 billion. It's like a million or 10 million is nothing anymore when you start looking at the cost of operating this system. And the ridership, Parsons Brinker House did our ridership estimate. The last heavy rail system where they were involved and did the ridership estimate, the actual ridership was 1/4 at the time of completion, when they had predicted what it would be, 1/4 of what they had predicted that it was going to be. They did our ridership presumption, our ridership projection. And yet we sit here and act as though, what an anomaly that the cost turned out to be so much more than what anyone could have realized. Well, in 2010, there was an outside expert that was brought in by then Governor Lingle, who did a study who had predicted that the costs were going to be in the range of $10 billion. The city didn't cooperate with them. They had to work around the city to try to get the information to make their projections. I would suggest to you that just as it's dishonest to act as though property taxes would be a bigger burden than would the general excise tax, I think it's very dishonest to act as though everybody's surprised that we're now talking about $10 billion rather than $5 billion, just like they'll act surprised when the ridership is 1/4 of what it was projected to be, or they act surprised when they find out that it's going to be an energy hog rather than save energy, or they act like they're surprised when the number of jobs is far less than what had been promised, or whether a UH economist says, hey, you can't just take $4 billion out of the economy from taxpayers, spend it on an inefficient project, and then say, look at all the jobs that are created. You've got to look at what was lost by virtue of taking that out of the private sector. Once you do that, you find out that none of the promises have worked out. And yet you're sitting here acting as though, well, we've already started down this road, even though we're looking at far more that yet would be spent as compared to what's been spent already. You're acting as though, well, we have no choice whatsoever, but we've got to raise the money using the general excise tax.
I'm looking at specifically property tax versus general excise tax. The average increase in property tax, if we had to go that route, would be about $300 per taxpayer. In order for your average general excise taxpayer to pay $300 in additional taxes from that surcharge, they would need to expend nearly $60,000 in purchases. How is your average low-income taxpayer, how is your average taxpayer going to spend $60,000 in a year, Mr. Roth? Those just don't pencil out.
With all due respect, you're confusing the payment of the tax and who bears the burden of that tax.
I'm going by strict dollar amount, sir. Your numbers don't add up. These are the facts. One would need to pay nearly $60,000 in purchases before they're hit with $300 in tax, just from the additional 0.5% on the GT. That is a fact, sir. I'm not making this up. This is a fact.
I would be very happy to engage in a forum with you where we could both, with the cameras running, walk through the numbers, support where we are on the impact of the general excise tax, and then let the public decide who's being accurate and who's
But we are
not.
looking specifically, we're not looking at all these other things. We need to focus in here on general excise tax versus real property tax. That is the discussion at hand. With all due respect, that is the discussion at hand. And the numbers that are here support exactly what I'm saying.
With all due respect, you need to do a little bit of homework, and at a minimum, you need to read the reports of the State Tax Review Commission, where every 5 years, without exception, in analyzing who bears the burden of these various taxes, in analyzing where these taxes show up. I've suggested that it's in the cost of goods and services for the most part with the general excise tax. It's out there. This is the work of experts. They've been paid a lot of money to do this analysis, experts from outside the state.
And we've seen that.
Don't
and I
have
have read those. I have read that. But what I'm saying is...
I think you didn't understand them then.
I think you're failing to understand exactly what the numbers are, with all due respect. The numbers specifically reiterate, it's proven. We've gotten the numbers from the administration. We've gotten the numbers from the real property tax assessors. We've gotten the numbers even from bond underwriters. Roughly $300 a year, average. This is on Tutu, who has a home out in Kaimuki, who's on a single fixed income. Papa passed away years ago, and we're going to ask her to pay another $300. For the life of me, I can't understand how it's fairer to do that on folks like that than it is to extend the general excise tax
With
charge.
all
But
due
Chair,
respect-
I
Okay.
thank you very much for allowing my questioning, but
Can
I
respond-
maintain
can
that
I
the
respond
GT
to that
extension.
statement?
Did you
is
want
the
to
best
respond? I
way
think we've had a
to pay for this
extensive,
system.
Right. Did you want a
No, I'm
response? Yeah, right. I think your responses have basically
thank you very
addressed,
much.
what he was trying to raise.